The phenomenon known as the bystander effect, also referred to as bystander apathy, hinges on the psychological predilection of individuals to avoid assisting a victim when many others are present. This concept was first suggested in the backdrop of Kitty Genovese's tragic murder in 1964 and has inspired extensive psychological research ever since. Factors that trigger this effect could include a higher number of bystanders, ambiguous situations, a feeling of group unity, and the diffusion of individual responsibility, which leads to group-wide denial. A person alone is likely to feel a stronger sense of responsibility compared to being part of a group, where the duty is shared and thus is perceived as less significant. Kitty Genovese's murder was reported incorrectly, indicating that about 38 passive onlookers bore witness. Recently, the effect's coherence and validity has been scrutinized and evaluated further with real-world instances documented on security footage. It has been discovered that the bystander effect could also be seen in professional environments where employees might hesitate to share their thoughts, worries, and proposals with their superiors. Social psychologists John M. Darley and Bibb Latane made the phenomenon more well-known by conducting experiments that illustrated this powerful and consistent effect. Post their interest piqued by Kitty Genovese's murder, they staged emergencies in controlled settings to measure participants' reactions alone or as part of a group. Participants' responses were timed to see whether and when they chose to intervene. Their studies demonstrated that an individual's likelihood to help decreases in the presence of others. For example, Bibb Latane and Judith Rudin, 1969, conducted an experiment with a woman playing the role of a distress victim, where they discovered that about 70 of solo participants offered help when they believed the woman was in pain. However, if paired with a stranger, only 40 of participants helped. Contrarily, a recent study by Philpott et al. 2019, analyzing real-life surveillance video recordings from the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and South Africa, found that bystander intervention was quite common, with over 90 of conflicts seeing at least one person stepping in to help. They concluded that the presence of more onlookers can sometimes increase the chances of intervention, contradicting the conventional wisdom behind the bystander effect. The response required in an emergency varies from case to case, necessitating prompt action. Bystanders undergo cognitive and behavioral processes shaped by 5 key characteristics. Latane and Darley, 1968, conducted a study among Columbia University students to understand the phenomenon of noticing during emergencies. They simulated an emergency, filling a room with smoke where students were filling out questionnaires, either alone or with stranger students alone. Noticed the smoke almost instantly, while it took up to 20 seconds for those in groups to respond. This delay was attributed to the societal norms of politeness, discouraging people from freely observing their surroundings, particularly in large groups. Once an incident is noticed, a bystander's decision to intervene depends on their interpretation of the situation. The principle of social influence suggests that bystanders gauge the reactions of others to determine if intervention is needed. If others appear unbothered, they are less likely to perceive the situation as an emergency and therefore refrain from intervening, a concept known as pluralistic ignorance or social proof. In the smoke experiment, many students and groups didn't report the smoke despite its obvious presence and discomfort it was causing. Only one group member reported it within the first 4 minutes, and by the end, 5 of 8 groups hadn't reported it at all. In groups that didn't report the smoke, perceptions of its cause and seriousness were downplayed, with no one suggesting a fire, but some opting for less alarming explanations, such as a faulty air conditioner. The story instigates that individuals are more prone to offer assistance in serious situations that are clearly perceived as emergencies. Darley and Latane emphasize that a bystander's extent of involvement hugely depends on 3 crucial elements: their belief in the victim's deservingness of help, their choice of intervention method, and their final act of implementation. They distinctly classify assistance into 2 types: doer, intervention, which involves informing the authorities about the emergency, and direct action. A research by Abraham S. Ross scrutinized the impact of having children around the scene of emergency and bystander intervention. This was judged using the responses of 36 male undergraduates to emergency situation. Contrary to the anticipation of augmented intervention, the study did not derive any significant variance in the pattern of intervention. In a 2011 meta-analysis, the bystander effect seemed to be softened in scenarios that are considered dangerous when the wrongdoers were present at the scene and when the physical intervention cost was high. The conclusions were reflective of the arousal cost-reward model, asserting that high-risk emergencies with clear danger not only hasten the recognition of crisis, but also influence higher emotional response and, consequently, more frequent assistance. Certain situations were found to significantly reduce the bystander effect, such as when bystanders were naive individuals instead of passive helpers or virtually present, and particularly when the bystanders and victims were not unfamiliar to each other. Stanley Milgram furnishes an alternative interpretation to bystander behavior, suggesting that their indifference might stem from their daily coping mechanisms to deal with informational overload, an idea backed by some degree of empirical research. Studying the National Crime Victimization Survey, NCU's data, Timothy Hart and Turner Smythe, found that at least one bystander was available during the 65 of violent instances. This included majority of physical assaults, 60-80, and decreasing occurrence during robberies, 49, and sex assaults, 20-80s. Victims' verdicts regarding bystander actions varied, with 48 of them being impartial, 37 helpful, 10 harmful, and 3 both. Attacks predominantly happened during evenings, involved both the victim and bystander being strangers where the bystander was present. Latane and Rodin, 1969, proposed that bystanders in uncertain scenarios tend to seek others' reactions for direction, often misconstruing their immobility as indifference, leading them to dismiss the situation as non-threatening. The likelihood of a bystander's intervention is also influenced by their familiarity with the environment of the emergency, as it increases their knowledge of how and where to seek aid. Conversely, bystanders are less prone to assist in unfamiliar surroundings. Garcia et al. 2002 study highlighted how the context of a social situation might dampen the response to help. The thought of being amidst many people or just one person can shape a person's propensity to help. Group cohesion is a significant determinant of a bystander's response. The greater the group's unity, the more likely they will align with the social responsibility norm, defined by Rutkowski et al. As the obligation to aid others in need and dependent on them. This notion was tested by dividing students into low and high cohesive groups and measuring their willingness to help a perceived victim. The high cohesive groups exhibited the quickest and most willing response, while the low cohesive ones lagged and were less likely to respond. Altruistic theory asserts that increased similarity between the helper and the one needing help can stimulate assisting behavior. Recent research has stressed the role of shared group identity in fostering bystander intervention. A 2005 experiment showed bystander intervention increased significantly if the injured individual donned a football jersey of a favored team, even more significantly, identifying as football fans elicited aid for rival team supporters as well, rather than neutral non-fan. Mark Levine and Simon Crowther's 2008 study further showed that while larger groups of strangers were less likely to intervene in instances of street violence, the intervention increased significantly among groups of friends. In the exploration of helping following eviction, both social identification and empathy have been found to be indicators of helpful actions. But once social identification is accounted for, empathy's relevance ceases. The reactions observed in events such as the apathy shown towards Wang Yu and the foreigner who fainted in a Shanghai subway, as argued by anthropologist Yongxian Yan from Clay, stem not just from caution towards potential scams, but also result from the deep-seated cultural norms ingrained within. The historical agrarian society of China, Yan emphasized the significant contrast existing between treatment towards familiar and unfamiliar individuals within Chinese society. The cultural roots of how a person interacts with their in-group and strangers have been highlighted as one of the major issues challenging modern China. However, Yan also underscores a shift towards more inclusive values due to global influences on the younger generation. India witnesses a similar phenomenon where bystanders displaying disregard following violent incidents link back to cultural roots. Indian sociologist Ashish Nandi argues this indifference roots from the brutalization of society due to swift cultural and educational alterations. Cultural influence on the bystander effect is emphasized further by psychologist Devika Kapoor, who believes that the habit of self-isolation from unrelated situations learned in childhood extends into adulthood. Darley and Latanis, 1968, research on the diffusion of responsibility revealed that crowd dynamics tend to decrease the individual urge to assist during emergencies, with assumptions being made that others, who are potentially more qualified, would intervene. Fears of unwanted assistance, legal implications, or being replaced by superior helpers further augment this effect. To address these concerns, several Good Samaritan laws have been put in place to limit potential legal issues for would-be helpers. A study published in the Journal of the International Ombudsman Association in 2009 also suggested that the hesitance to stand against unacceptable behaviors in the workplace can be chalked up to a multitude of reasons, the foremost being fear of damaging relationships and facing negative consequences. Despite these obstacles, there remains a percentage of people willing to step forward and act against these behaviors. The study of ombuds practitioners underscores the fact that bystander behavior in real-life situations is multifaceted, influenced by the context, managerial viewpoints, organizational structures, if existing, and various personal motivations, endorsing the notion that some observers indeed demonstrate responsibility. Gerald Kuchar and Patricia Keith Spiegel's 2010 article cited a NIBAC study proving that impromptu interventions by peers and onlookers could rectify or halt unacceptable scientific conduct. John Quinones's Prime Time. What Would You Do? Broadcast on ABC scrutinizes bystander effects. Actors enacts, usually non-emergency, circumstances while the focus shifts on unassuming observers' responses and activities. Issues addressed range from millionaire test cheating to elderly shoplifting, racism, and homophobia. Research indicates the bystander effect potentially transpires in computer-mediated communication scenarios. Empirical evidence validates that individuals can assume the bystander role even when they cannot observe the distressed person physically. Throughout the experiment, 400 online chat groups were scrutinized. Alternate use of two plants as victims in each chat room was employed. A male represented by screen name Jake Harmon or a female with the screen name Susie Harmon. The experiment aimed to decipher if the victim's gender was relevant, if the chat group size played a role, or if requesting a particular person's assistance by directly addressing their screen name made any difference. Findings revealed no correlation between the victim's gender and the likelihood of assistance from a bystander. In line with previous observations by Latane and Darley, the number of chat room participants indeed influenced the outcome. The response time was faster in smaller groups compared to larger ones, however. The effect disappeared when the victim, Jake or Susie, sought help from a specific chat group member. An average response time of 36.38 seconds was recorded when a particular person was called out, as opposed to 5,153 seconds when no specific person was highlighted. An intriguing revelation of the research was that a victim's plea to a named individual significantly influenced intervention. The group size had no effect when the victim specifically addressed a person for assistance. In contrast, the group size effect persisted when the victim did not address anyone specifically. While most studies focus on adults, children can also be bystanders. In 2007, a study by Robert Thornburg identified 7 reasons why children remain unresponsive when a fellow classmate is in trouble. These included trivialization, dissociation, embarrassment association, and prioritizing work, prioritizing a current task over lending help, complying with a competitive norm, audience modeling, emulating the behaviors of other audience members, and responsibility transfer, assuming that another person will take responsibility. In a subsequent study, Thornburg deduced 7 stages of moral deliberation among Swedish schoolchildren in bystander situations. This included acknowledging that something is wrong, etc. The story presents a comprehensive examination of the factors influencing student intervention during incidents of aggression. Findings indicate that students who do not view themselves as friends or social equals with the victim are less likely to step in, especially when high-status students are involved. On the contrary, low-status students are found to be more likely to intervene, particularly when surrounded by their peers. The decision to intervene is shaped not only by the individual analysis of costs and benefits, but also by the social and institutional environment. In the South African legal system, the term extenuating circumstances was introduced to promote justice in court decisions, but this term lacked a clear definition. In order to flesh out this concept, the courts began to use expert testimonials from social psychologists. Concepts like de-individuation, bystander apathy, and conformity were cited as potential extenuating circumstances. This was seen in the case of SUVs, Sibisi, and others. 1989, in which members of SARU were charged with the murder of 4 non-striking workers. Defense evidence was provided by social anthropologist Boet Coetzee and psychologists Scott Fraser and Andrew Coleman. They argued that factors including de-individuation, bystander apathy, group conformity, and collectivist cultural traits influence the defendant's actions. They explain that being part of a group can blur individual accountability, a phenomenon known as de-individuation. These arguments contributed to reducing the charges for 4 of the defendants. The narrative further explores how some regions legally obligate bystanders to help during emergencies. For example, the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms requires everyone to lend aid when someone's life is in danger, provided it doesn't endanger their own or someone else's life. Brazil's penal code similarly makes it a crime not to aid or call for help for injured or endangered people, including abandoned children, as long as it is safe to do so. Numerous organizations are establishing mechanisms to empower bystanders to speak out against perceived inappropriate behavior. These mechanisms, typically in the form of complaint systems, provide various avenues for action, including the role of an organizational ombudsman who offers a high degree of confidentiality and does not keep employment record. A notorious catalyst for research into the bystander effect was the harrowing event involving Catherine Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old bartender. On March 13, 1964, Genovese was savagely attacked, sexually assaulted, and subsequently murdered on her commute home at 3 a.m. in Queens, New York. The incident, publicized by the New York Times in a sensationalized manner, claimed that 38 witnesses bore silent witness to the crime, failing to intervene or alert the police until Genovese's life was lost. The tragedy of Genovese's murder sparked significant conversation and led psychology researchers Latane and Darley to develop the diffusion of responsibility theory. This theory contends that bystanders' inaction was due to the assumption that others present would take responsibility, prompting their own inactivity. It's worthwhile noting that a 2007 American Psychologist article exposed media exaggerations surrounding the case. The number of actual eyewitnesses was significantly lower, and the event did trigger at least one call to the police. The enduring societal issue of bystander inaction was devastatingly highlighted again on October 24, 2009. A female student of Richmond High School was tragically gang-raped and beaten in a dim courtyard outside a school event. Witnesses reported that as many as 20 people spectated the prolonged 2-hour assault, and some even cheered and filmed the scene. The young woman was left with extensive physical injuries and emotional trauma. The incident understandably provoked widespread outrage. On yet another occasion, May 30, 2011, Memorial Day, Raymond Zach, a 53-year-old man, ventured into the waters off Robert Crown Memorial Beach in Alameda, California. Regardless of the ambiguity about Zach's intentions, he endured the freezing water's neck, deep for around an hour, while observers from the beach and their homes refrained from attempting a rescue. The delay of the emergency services in handling the situation due to training and certification limitations ultimately led to Zach's unfortunate demise due to hypothermia. This case serves as another example of the bystander effect in action. In a shocking incident that took place on October 13, 2021, a passenger on a Philadelphia SEPTA train was subjected to sexual harassment and eventually raped by another commuter. Several witnesses allegedly observed this horrific event unfold, with some individuals reportedly even recording the attack, yet no one attempted to halt the assault or communicate with law enforcement. It was only when an off-duty employee stepped onto the train, noticed and reported the assault that a SEPTA officer apprehended the perpetrator at the 69th Street Transportation Center. The assault, which lasted nearly 40 minutes, along with the passenger's apparent apathy, was captured on SEPTA surveillance cameras and subsequently drew global attention. Some academics have suggested the bystanders may have been unsure how to respond to the situation. In a similar unsettling episode on July 2016, a Myanmar native and domestic worker, Pyong Ngaya Don, 24, faced brutality that led to her demise at the hands of her employer Gayatri Murugayan and Gayathiri's mother, Premasaya's mother, Premasi Narayanasamy. The employer and mother were arrested and charged for murder, while a third accomplice, Gayathiri's police officer husband Kevin Chelvam, was indicted for abuse against domestic staff and suspended from police duties in June 2021. Gayathiri was sentenced to 30 years of jail for culpable homicide. The case induced a public outcry due to its immense cruelty. Similarities were found with the murder of Kitty Genovese, bringing light to the bystander effect, as despite people suspected Pyong was being abused during regular health checks, they remained silent, taken in by the denial of Gayathiri and her family. In contrast to initial theories suggesting bystanders usually refrain from intervening, a substantial 2019 global study of street disputes in Lancaster, Amsterdam, and Cape Town showed that intervention was the norm. The likelihood of intervention increased as the number of bystanders rose, challenging the existing theory and offering an inspiring perspective on human behavior.